Hi, thanks for stopping by again. What I'd like to do today is continue with part two of my story about Samuel Henderson Sr., my fourth great grandfather. And I especially want to give thanks to Shelley Dawson Davies, who did a lot of the research that I'm actually going to be sharing with you today. Guessing that she's probably some distant cousin, and wanted to express my appreciation to her for putting a lot of the details together that I'm going to share with you today. So if you remember last time, we left off with Samuel had just lost his first wife, Mary Goforth. She had died and was buried there in the Presbyterian Church, leaving Samuel as a widower with 11 children. As you can imagine, be very difficult. But it's said that his strong faith in Presbyterianism actually helped him to get through some of those hard times. And for the next 2 years, he was kind of on his own, raising those 11 children until he married Elizabeth Harris. Elizabeth Harris was 15 years younger than Samuel, and she was also his daughter-in-law's sister. There wasn't probably a big dating pool there in Bellevue, Missouri, so he actually married his daughter-in-law's sister, like I said, 15 years his junior, but she was very much up to the task. She was actually willing to step in to the role of homemaker and mother to the 7 youngest of Samuel's children, and actually over the course of the next 10 years added another 6 children to their marriage. It says she was a very good mother, making sure that all of her children attended to their chores, their studies, and their spiritual education. Now, Elizabeth and Samuel were still very active in the Presbyterian Church during their marriage, but they were also very welcoming to any traveling preachers who happened to come through the area, and were delighted to hear what they have to say. Now, in the 1830s, there started to be a lot of talk among the preachers about a new and strange religion that was claiming the Lord was gathering his elect in western Missouri, where Zion would soon be built. The newspapers even reported, I give credit to Shelley, she found a newspaper report from 1831 that talked about these missionaries who would travel 2 by 2, and they persist in their power to work miracles. They say they have often seen them done. The sick are healed, the lame walk, the devils are cast out, and these assertions are made by men heretofore considered rational men. So that's kind of an interesting article that was in the paper. Over the course of the next few years, there were a lot of reports and cautions and warnings given about the Mormons, as they were called, who were gathering in generating fear and suspicion among the people of Missouri. Samuel and Elizabeth decided to finally listen to what these Mormons themselves had to say about their religion. And in 1838, Mormon missionaries came through the Bellevue Valley there in Missouri, and it didn't take long for Samuel and Elizabeth to decide and understand the truth. They were not only eager to be baptized, but they also wanted to share the good news of the gospel with their friends and family. And they would actually host meetings in their home, and also they would lodge the elders as they were passing through the area and stayed there. So they actually put them up and boarded them as they taught the gospel. Many of the extended family did join with the Mormons that same year, and it was a very exciting and perilous time to be a Mormon in Missouri in the 1830s. Mormons were being driven out of towns along the western border almost as soon as they had settled them. The entire Mormon population in Jackson County was forced out in 1833. Homes and crops were burned as they went. The Saints regrouped in Caldwell, Carroll, and Daviess counties, also received the similar treatment. So when the Hendersons were baptized and joined the church, This was the same time that Governor Boggs had declared that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. So, despite the growing threats, the Hendersons decided that they wanted to follow the Lord at all costs. So, they sold their farm in Bellevue and traveled west to join the rest of the saints, leaving behind some of the relatives who decided that they would remain loyal to their Presbyterian faith. So, as many saints were doing, they now headed west, roads going out. In 1839, the church had acquired both sides of the Mississippi near the small town of Commerce, Illinois, and members began to stream in this area. Samuel and Elizabeth were among those the first to build their homes on the banks of the river in what would become known as Nauvoo, choosing a lot not far from the riverbank on the corner of Hibbard and Durfee streets. And I've taken that as an assignment myself. The next time I'm visiting Nauvoo, I want to go down there and see what still might remain on that corner of Hibbard and Durfee. Now, this was a good location for Samuel because the first thing he did was set up a sawmill. This was a growing city, newcomers flowing into it. They needed homes, they needed businesses, and he was able to work to supply lumber to help these people get set up. Elizabeth had her hands full at home, taking care of a large family in less than ideal circumstances. Like most of the people who first arrived in Nauvoo, they lived in a makeshift tent, and all of her household goods were stored in the back of a wagon until Samuel could put up a rough cabin for them to live in. And if that wasn't tough enough, Elizabeth was also pregnant again. She gave birth to another boy, named him after the prophet. He was named Joseph. Not long after that, another boy was born, named after the prophet's brother, called him Hiram. And then again, a third boy was born. His name was Ira. Now, sadly, two of those three passed away, and they were buried in Nauvoo. So it was a difficult time, but she was looking to the future. In 1841, the prophet Joseph pronounced that it was the Lord's desire that a temple would be built in Nauvoo. And construction began immediately, and it basically took over the lives of the saints for the next 5 years. Blocks of limestone were quarried out nearby. These were dressed and polished on the temple site near Mulholland Street, but timber was a little bit harder to find. And I wasn't aware of this, but up in Wisconsin's Black River, the church purchased a sawmill, and their wood was cut. There was a large supply of pine trees. That wood was floated down the river to Nauvoo, and then was taken in, and part of that work was done at Henderson's mill there in the Nauvoo, and it was called the Pineries Mission, is one of the things I found. So several hundred miles up the Mississippi to attain and get the lumber that was needed for the construction of the temple. But the Lord couldn't wait, and revelations continued to come. And one of those, at a funeral service in 1840, Joseph Smith taught the doctrine of baptism for the dead. And overjoyed saints immediately began performing the ordinances for baptisms for the dead in the Mississippi River. And these were finally moved to the temple as soon as the basement was finished, to a point where they could construct a temporary wooden font, and that was dedicated in November of 1841. Samuel joined hundreds of other saints in the Nauvoo area to perform proxy baptism for his parents, grandparents, and many other relatives, which I thought was very, very interesting. Now, while they were working on the temple, there were no other really places to meet, and so Sunday services were often held in several wooded areas near the temple site. And then the Hendersons would also attend a general meeting in the morning, followed by a private evening prayer meetings that were held in individual homes in Nauvoo. Samuel also took the opportunity to seek out Hiram Smith to obtain a patriarchal blessing. And I have part of that patriarchal blessing I want to share with you today. Hiram promised in the patriarchal blessing to Samuel that he would be numbered in the covenant in the fullness. And you shall go and come and be preserved, and you shall be blessed also in future, spiritually and temporally. Spiritually, to your full satisfaction, with joy and consolation in the Holy Ghost, and with knowledge of the things of God. So both Samuel and Elizabeth would need that additional spiritual strength in the coming years, because they were about to pass through some very difficult times. In the winter of 1842, there was a terrible sickness that struck a lot of the people, including Samuel and Elizabeth's own family. Their oldest son, James, and his wife, Anna, had been living on a farm about 30 miles outside of Nauvoo. Anna became sick and was after caring for sick children, and she died. And James, who was already suffering from rheumatism, says he wore himself out in the care and trying to provide for his 9 children. His health gradually deteriorated, and he finally died as well. So these orphan children were actually, Elizabeth stepped in, and to raise those children, she was both the aunt and, I guess, step-grandmother to them. And that brought now the Henderson family, their household now numbered 14 souls. Now, grandfather Samuel and his grandmother Elizabeth were among the very last to leave Nauvoo. It says they were among the final 600 who were forced to flee Nauvoo at gunpoint during the week of September 1846. And we just passed that anniversary here just this past week. This was a group of people that were referred to as the poor camp. They were the elderly, the poor, but some of them had been asked to remain to take care of the crops and to harvest the crops that were coming. We're now mid-September here in Virginia, and we're still getting some tomatoes out of our garden. The pumpkins are coming on, so there would have been crops that could have been harvested in that September time frame. Samuel, by this time, is in his 60s, but he was still responsible for his orphan grandchildren, and he had remained to help harvest the crops along with his son, Samuel Jr. Now, being the poor camp, they were very poor and destitute after being driven from their homes. They traveled about 9 miles into Iowa and stopped for about a month awaiting aid from the saints who had already left. One of the stories, and I've actually shared this in one of my other stories, we had a very good account, but on October 31st, there was a miracle that took place, and it was known as the miracle of the quail. Of course, the people were hungry, destitute, cold, and what happened was thousands of quail fluttered into the poor camp and were easily gathered up. The story goes that one landed on the lap of Elizabeth Henderson, the wife of Samuel, and they took that, so she was even, in her condition, was able to catch some of these very weary quail and basically kept them alive. It said that to them, this was a sign from the heavens that the Lord would take care of them. So Samuel and his family now joined the rest of the saints walking west, and they arrived in Salt Lake City on October of 1851. They stayed in Salt Lake for a few years and then moved up to the Kaysville area, and where they stayed for another 3 years, finally returning to Salt Lake. And there they bought a house and a lot in what was known as the 6th Ward back then. I have no idea where that is now. And they lived there for the rest of their lives. Samuel Henderson died in February of 1856 in Salt Lake City, just slightly less than 5 years after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley. So that's the kind of a little bit of the story on Samuel, Mary, and Elizabeth. I'm a direct line descendant of Samuel and Mary, and I know there's some of you out there that are descendants from Elizabeth, but all in all, this is a great legacy and a great story, and I think one that we can take real pride in as descendants of Samuel Henderson. And hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for stopping by. Look forward to seeing you next time.